So what I'm going to talk to you about very briefly is how the tobacco industry keeps targeting children no matter what any kind of effort is made to try to stop it from targeting children. Here is the number of cigarettes produced in the United States from 1850, when we had none. The mid-1850s was when cigarettes were first introduced into this country. By 1900, you have to add 3 zeros to every one of these numbers. So by 1900, we had to make the bar that small to show you 2.5 billion with a B. Here's 1930, 1950, the Surgeon General's, the first Surgeon General's report happened in here. It kept going up and up and up, and it didn't begin to come down, the number that produced, until 1990, well, 1980. The curve started going down. So this is one thing you might be able to expect in watching a marijuana industry grow in your states. There's not any reason not to expect it. In the 50s, studies began linking smoking to various kinds of diseases. And in 1954, the tobacco industry, or companies, created the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, which took out full-page ads in US newspapers across the United States to assure the public that smoking is not injurious to health. The industry advertised heavily on TV. A year later, Philip Morris introduced the Marlboro Man. One of the interesting things about Marlboro is that it was a cigarette aimed at women, and it had very low sales. And when the Marlboro Man was introduced and all of the money was poured into advertising the Marlboro Man, it switched to become the most popular cigarette among men in the United States. Ultimately, 3 Marlboro men have died of lung cancer, 3 of the models. In 1964 was the first Surgeon General's report that said smoking causes lung cancer, emphysema, and other diseases. And Philip Morris introduced Virginia Slims, targeting women and girls. This is a kind of feminist manifesto when women's rights first began to be talked about by women. And you can't see the print, but when you get home and look at your flash drives, you'll be able to read the copy on this sign. It's worth reading. In 1967, the Federal Trade Commission ruled that cigarettes must comply with the Fairness Doctrine. How many people know what the Fairness Doctrine was? Not too many. Okay, so the Fairness Doctrine said broadcasters must air counter ads, counter messages, by anyone who wants to offer one when advertising claims seem to be outrageous. So we began having counter ads. I think it was on a ratio of 1 to 4. Tim, does that sound right? Okay. And so broadcasters and others began airing counter ads and publishing them in magazines. This says, "In all that's me, there's a seed of mystery." And this says, "For all that tobacco has done to me, I smoke out of my tracheotomy." I can't even say that word. And you can see her necklace is concealing a trach. That had an impact, and similar ads like it did. So 3 years later, Congress banned TV and radio advertising, and there's a fair amount of research that shows the counter ads were more effective than the ban on advertising. And even though there was a ban, the industry still found ways to advertise on TV. How many of you remember seeing Marlboro cars in NASCAR races and billboards along baseball games advertising various cigarette brands, et cetera, et cetera? It took a long, long time for that to change, and I'll show you what actually drove that in just a little bit. In 1988, the Surgeon General's report found that nicotine is addictive and stated that, and 6 years later, the tobacco CEOs still swore to Congress, still maintained it wasn't, and swore that to Congress that nicotine is not addictive. And there they all are, raising their right hands and saying, nope, nicotine's not addictive. And at those same hearings, a model for Winston cigarettes told Congress, of course, children aren't the only targets of the tobacco industry. I asked an R.J. Reynolds executive why he and his colleagues didn't smoke. We don't smoke the blank, we just sell it, he said. We reserve that right for the young, the poor, the black, and the stupid. In 1988, R.J. Reynolds introduced Joe Camel. A study in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, found that the campaign was more successful with children than adults. 5- and 6-year-olds were as familiar with Joe Camel as Mickey Mouse. In 1994, this is when things began to significantly change, and that is that the state of Mississippi, realized that it was paying out more in Medicaid funds to treat tobacco-related diseases than it was bringing in tobacco-related taxes. And it decided it was tired of paying for that, and it was time for the industry to do it. And so Mississippi started the ball rolling, and many states joined, eventually nearly all of them, to sue the tobacco industry to recover the cost of treating those patients with tobacco-related diseases. In 1996, while that lawsuit was going on with the states, David Kessler, who was the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, asserted that nicotine is addictive. The Surgeon General says it's addictive, that cigarettes are a drug delivery device, and that the FDA, had the authority to regulate cigarettes. And after that, if anybody is interested in this, I recommend his book, A Question of Intent, by David Kessler, because it chronicles the struggle that FDA went through trying to assert its authority to regulate cigarettes. And interestingly, as the court battles began, a district court in Winston-Salem found that, yes, the FDA did have the authority to do that. But by the time the issue got to the Supreme Court said, no, FDA does not have such authority without specific action from Congress. So in 1998, the Master Settlement Agreement occurred, which is that the states and the tobacco industry agreed to settle with each other. And the tobacco industry agreed to do a number of things: to reimburse states in perpetuity for its Medicaid costs to treat tobacco-related diseases, designating $206 billion a year for the first 25 years. It also agreed to a ban on any ads in magazines with a youthful percentage of youthful audience, such as the ones that David was showing us. It agreed to a ban on billboard advertising, those big billboards anyway out there along the roadside. And it agreed to pay an independent nonprofit, which turned out to be the Legacy Foundation, $250 million a year for the prevention of, to prevent kids from starting and to help those who had started stop smoking. And it banned marketing to children. Now, here's what happened. Well, no, we'll go there in a minute. Internal documents that were revealed throughout those state lawsuits showed how dependent the industry is on smoking children. The Liggett Group said, if you are really and truly not going to sell cigarettes to children, you are going to be out of business in 30 years. R.J. Reynolds said, realistically, if our company is to survive and prosper, over the long term, we must get our share of the youth market. Laura Lodge said, the base of our business is the high school student. So even though they agreed to not market to children anymore, they nearly tripled their budget for advertising and marketing from $6 billion a year in 1998 to $15 billion a year in 2005. And even though in 1998 there are no listings for price discounts in the reports from the Federal Trade Commission, by 2005, they were devoting 71% of that $15 billion to price discounts paid to cigarette retailers or wholesalers in order to reduce the price of cigarettes to consumers. Who do you think those consumers were? More and more taxes were levied on cigarettes, raising the price. And all the research tells us that the higher the price, the fewer children start because they can't afford it. So the industry got around its pledge not to market directly to children by marketing indirectly to them. To combat higher taxes, the tobacco industry also makes new, cheaper products that appeal to children. So these are Camel Snooze. These are orbs that are little candies of nicotine that look a lot like Tic Tacs, and we all worry about that. These are flavored cigars, which FDA may or may not do anything about. So here's grape, strawberry, pineapple, peach. Wild, I can't even see what that is, wild something. So in 2009, Congress took up what the Supreme Court ruled about 10 years before and created the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, which does now give the FDA the power to regulate tobacco. And that means that the FDA can regulate advertising, can regulate warning labels, hazardous products, new products, including those that the industry claims are safer. And if they are, fine, but if they're not, they won't get into the market. After that long struggle that the FDA went through prior to Congress acting, David Kessler concluded that after a decade of trying to bring tobacco under control, the solution to the smoking problem rests with the bottom line. I can't emphasize that enough, how much I agree with that. Congress should, he says, prohibit companies from continuing to profit, end of story. Charter a corporation to take over the business, ban all promotion, control distribution to prevent access by kids. Revenues should be used only to underwrite costs, and the remainder into a fund to pay liability claims, fund medical research, finance youth prevention programs. Interestingly, and on your flash drives that you'll get tomorrow, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation financed some 40 of the world's top researchers in tobacco marketing and tobacco, and they have all written papers that have been published in a journal called Tobacco Control. And the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has provided a link so that you can read those articles free rather than having to pay, as I did, $180 to subscribe to the journal. And so on your flash drive, be sure to look at that and be sure to read those papers. What's interesting to me is, as we are in this country beginning to talk about and doing legalization of marijuana, the tobacco industry researchers are going in the other direction. And one of the recommendations that one of the researchers is making is exactly what Kessler said: prohibit the companies from continuing to profit, taking the profit out of smoking. Yes, you can grow it in your own yard if you want to, but we're not going to allow sales, which is very interesting. That whole series is called Tobacco Endgame, and it's worth reading just to understand the kinds of forces that have been at work here and that will be at work with marijuana, because it might give you some ideas. So in 2008, the Altria company, which is the largest company in the country selling cigarettes, it owns Philip Morris USA, began diversifying. Initially, the cigarette companies diversified into foods. They bought Kraft Foods, and they weren't able to make a go of it, so they shed that. And now Altria has acquired, Chateau Saint Michelle Wine Estates, which is the largest producer of Rieslings in the US. So we now have one addictive drug industry purchasing the largest producer of another addictive drug industry. And that raises the question, in 2012, our 2 states have legalized marijuana for recreational use, the voters in your states, not you. And so that raises the question, if Congress resolves the federal and state conflict eventually, will the tobacco industry further diversify and take over a third addictive drug, i.e. the marijuana industry? And when you think about it, they have all of the resources they need to get into that market. This, just as a matter of interest, is a producer in Colorado that makes Dixie elixirs and food products, marijuana food products, and they are going big time in terms of seeing a market not only in your state but in Washington as well, and perhaps other states. So I guess the point that I want to give you is that lawsuits didn't really stop it. We have reduced tobacco smoking among kids, however, and among adults. However, it's leveling out at about 20% past month users. And we don't want, that's not good enough. We need to get it lower for kids. And the point that I want to make to you is, whether it's a lawsuit, and a major significant one at that with the master tobacco settlement, or whether it is a government taking action, or whether it's Lord knows what else, the industry always finds a way to get around the barrier that's been put up and continue to marketing to kids. They understand they need to do that to stay in business. I don't think you're going to find it's very different with marijuana.